I do want to talk about young people. They're one of your four reasons for hope. But just leading into that conversation is this idea that you said there are lots of obstacles in the way. And your main message that you take around the world is that we each of us have a role to play, no matter how small. And every day, every single one of us makes an impact upon the planet. And the cumulative effect of small actions that we all take will make a difference. And I just wonder how you stop people from feeling helpless and that their small acts don't make a difference, because we need, many of us feel, something bigger, that we have to kind of wait for governments, we have to wait for big business to get on board. And that does make people feel that each individual thing they do, it's very easy to feel that won't make a difference.
Yes, I know. And if it was just you picking up trash or saving water, electricity, biking instead of going in a car, or whatever little thing you do, if it was just you, it wouldn't make a bit of difference. But if it's hundreds, then thousands, then millions of people all living ethical lives, making ethical choices each day, like what do you buy? That's as simple as that. If it harmed the environment, don't buy it. If it was led to cruelty to animals, like factory farmed meat and eggs and milk, don't buy it. If it if it's cheap because of unfair wages or forced labor, don't buy it. But you see, in order for everybody to make those decisions, which more and more people are, you have to eliminate poverty.
Mm.
Because if you're living in deep poverty, you have to do whatever it takes to keep yourself and your family alive. You have to cut down the trees. You know it's going to lead to soil erosion, but you need the land to grow food for your family or to get charcoal to sell. And if you're in an urban area, you're going to buy the cheapest junk food. You can't afford to ask those questions because you've got to survive somehow.
Mm.
So solving one problem very often highlights another problem. But quite honestly, the answer to this feeling of helplessness, which I've, explained to so many people, just think, okay, you must have heard the saying, think globally, act locally, right?
I was just going to come to your renewed version.
Yes. Act locally. Act locally first. Think of what you can do, something you care about in your community. And hopefully you have a little group that can work with you, because that always makes it much better. And then when you know that there are people all around the world, which there are, doing little things like that, then you dare think globally. And so here's where the media should be playing a much different role. And yes, they need to tell us about the dark side. We need to know. We can't hide from it. We're in a bad spot. But traveling around the world, as I have been lucky enough to do, I've met so many amazing projects and so many incredible people. And if the media just would spend time explaining how, with time or with help, an area that's been totally destroyed, like totally, all the living things gone, but it can come, nature will reclaim it, and animals and plants can start recolonizing. And, media needs to spend more time talking about the incredible people doing wonderful things. That includes children.
And exactly, the resilience of nature is one of your other four pillars of hope. And it's really interesting to hear you talk about this, the idea that poverty just must be tackled first and foremost, because we still do live in a world where worrying about climate is just something that you can do if you have the time and the money, and it's just not something. And hopefully, we want to move towards a world where that is something that is much more inclusive of everybody, those sorts of ways of living in a greener way. And you say exactly, there are so many things across the world to take heart from, and your relationships with young people is really one of those things. And I've been listening, as I said, to the Hopecast and hearing these people so young, 12, 13, call in from across the world to sort of talk about how you've inspired them. It's no wonder that they are a great source of hope to you. I wonder, though, can they really create change? Do you feel they can? Because obviously they're not in positions of power yet.
I know they can, because they are. And the point is, we're now in, well, I think it's over 65 countries, hundreds and thousands of groups. And because I learned about the interconnection of things out in the rainforest, you know, every plant and animal species having a role to play in this beautiful living tapestry, we decided, when Roots and Shoots began with 12 high school students in Tanzania in 1991, we decided, okay, every group will do 3 projects between them, one to help people, one to help other animals, one to help the environment, because it's all so interconnected. And it doesn't mean that every child must do all 3, but they must share the information. So what began with 12 high school students now has members from even some preschool, lots of kindergarten, very strong in university, everything in between, more and more people who are actually, you know, like members of staff of a big corporation, but basically for youth. And what the young people are doing, the numbers of trees they've planted, the people that they've inspired, the parents and grandparents whom they have changed. I'll give you one story here. I was talking to a CEO of a big corporation. He was in Singapore, actually. And his company has worked really, really hard to be totally zero emission and, you know, off the grid and everything. And he said there were 3 reasons why we changed. Firstly, we saw the writing on the wall. We saw that if we continue to use up finite natural resources at the pace that we are, as we stupidly put GDP growth ahead of protecting the environment, if we go on doing that, that's the end of our business. Secondly, consumer pressure. People are more and more demanding ethically produced products. But he said what finally tipped the balance for me was a few years ago when my daughter, who was about 10 years old, I think, she came home from school and she said, "Daddy, they tell me at school that what you're doing is hurting the environment. Is that true? Because that's my environment. I'm growing up into that. Is that true, Daddy?" And he said, that was it.
I love that story, many stories that you tell. And there's a wonderful story, I think you told it perhaps on a recent podcast, of when the CEOs of some oil companies were investing in Roots and Shoots, and you told them what that meant about. Perhaps you could relay that.
I said, you realize, I mean, they were supporting it. They were giving us money because they are actually trying to do pretty well, but, you know, they're not there yet. And it was in China, actually. And I said, you do realize that all these young people who you're supporting are being educated to absolutely shun the products that you're producing from oil and gas. And he thanked me. I mean, there was a bit of a silence. I was talking to all the top executives of that company, but he thanked me. He said, you've made us think even more deeply than we were before.
I love that story. We talked a bit about animal sentience earlier. I was saying that, of course, you were one of the first people, or the first person, that made people understand that animals feel much more than until then people felt that they did. And we're becoming much more aware of that. And you say in the book, we must face up to the problems, you know, caused by this factory farming, by farming, really, by just turning animals into something that we put all over the land without much thought for their well-being. But I wonder if I could just put a quandary to you, which is, if we want to, obviously, for the sake of the planet, for the sake of the animals, move away from farming them in these ways, which of course we do, what is it that we should hope for or encourage? Because if we moved away entirely from meat eating as a population, what happens then to the hope, I suppose, of the people whose livelihoods are in farming, and albeit farming perhaps in a more local and more animal compassionate way?
Well, you know, my real problem is with the factory farms, and the factory farms raising animals for food or for milk or for dairy, because the conditions are so, I don't know, have you personally watched any of the secretly filmed footage?
Mm.
Because
It's
you can't sleep.
deeply disturbing.
It's so terrible. And when you think that each one of those animals is a personality and they have feelings, they have fear and pain. And when I learned about factory farms, I think when I first went to Africa in 1960, we didn't have any in England. I hadn't heard about them. And then I read Peter Singer's book, Animal Liberation, about the factory farms. And I was utterly, utterly shocked. And the next time I looked at a piece of meat on my plate, I thought, this is symbolic of fear, pain, death. And that was it. I didn't eat anymore. I have become vegan since being on lockdown here because my niece is a great cook and she's vegan too. On tour, it's difficult to be vegan, but I've been vegetarian for forever. And, you know, so if we're going to eat animals, and some people have to, and then we need animals who have a decent life before they're killed. But you know, you said something so important about what do we do about the people who make their living from this kind of farming. We have to find alternative ways for them to make a living. This is how we protect the chimps in Africa. When I'd had that conference, I thought I need to go out to Africa and find out firsthand what the problems facing the chimps are. And I got money to go to 6 of the range countries. And I learned about the chimp problems, yes, but I also learned about the plight faced by so many of the African people living around chimp habitat. And when I flew over the tiny Gombe National Park, which was once part of the great equatorial forest belt across Africa, and that was in 1960, and in 1970 it was part of this forest. But by the late 80s, I was shocked to look from a small plane to see a tiny island of forest, and all around were bare hills. And the people there were too poor to buy food from elsewhere. Their land was over-farmed and infertile. They were cutting down the trees to survive. And that's when I realized if we don't find ways for them to make a living without destroying the environment, we can't save chimps, forests, or anything else. And so we began this, what we call Takari, take care, Takari. And it's now throughout the chimp range in Tanzania and in 6 other African countries. And it's totally holistic. And it includes stuff like scholarships so girls can stay in school beyond puberty. We provide family planning information. We don't give it, but the local people do. And they know that a way out of poverty is a good education. They can't afford anymore to educate 8 or 10 children. So they love family planning. And, you know, so it's all of these problems interrelated with each other and thinking it through. And there's an awful lot of problems. Sometimes you think you've solved a problem and you have, but it's created another one which you didn't even think about.
But despite that, and also despite, you know, you've lived through a lot of dark times, or times that have shown humans at their worst. We've concentrated a lot now on the sort of destruction to the environment, but, you know, you talk in the book, you've lived through the wars, the Holocaust, Cold War, you know, the genocides. And what's so fascinating is that you've maintained this generally positive, optimistic, but hopeful above all spirit, this indomitable human spirit. You possess it in spades. I think you still maintain, despite all of that, that we all possess it. So I wonder if you could explain what it is and why you think that.
Well, I think, you know, there are some people who stand out as icons. I call it when you tackle seemingly impossible problems and won't give up, and very often succeed. And, you know, you could pick people like Nelson Mandela, who tackled apartheid, that evil regime in South Africa, and people like Martin Luther King Jr. And, you know, you can think of many icons out there. But then look around at just people where you live. You may find somebody who's migrated from a country where he and his family lost everything to war, or these days increasingly from change of climate where they can no longer practice their old way of life. and they can arrive in a country with nothing, and yet somehow they build up a life for themselves. They're probably greeted with discrimination and hostility. We know all about that in the UK. Some of what goes on is so shocking, I don't like to think about it. But when they get through that, you go and bother to talk to them, they smile at you, and they've made a life for themselves, and they haven't given up. And that's one reason why I was so angry when Richard Dawkins took out advertising space on London buses with a message which was something like, if you believe in God, you're stupid. And you think of somebody who's lost everything, coming to a new country, not knowing the language, just with their faith, and then they read a message telling them they're stupid. That is, it's almost cruel, isn't it?
I mean, you talking about faith is a really important part of this as well, and the links between hope and faith. And I know you say in the book that hope and faith are two very different things, but you talk in depth in your conversations about something that you feel does, I think, spur on your hope and to sort of enhance it, which is an idea that there is a sort of outside force and a spiritual power. And I wonder how much that does reinforce your hope.
Oh, I think it does. And I think, some people who are part of an organized religion, I think that faith does give them hope for the future, even if it's future in another world. They have some kind of hope which helps them to live in this life. But for me, when I was out in the rainforest, especially, I had this very strong spiritual connection with some, I don't know, call it creator, call it whatever. And it just felt to me that there was something out there that had created the wonder on this planet. And we hear, oh, we know, we've understood. It's the Big Bang that created the universe. So, probably did. But what created the Big Bang, please? What was before the Big Bang? And what has really, really thrilled me is that recently, more and more of the top scientific minds have come out saying, absolutely, there is intelligence behind the creation of the universe. And of course, Albert Einstein, who's one of the great minds, he talked about that as well. But I've had experiences in my life, as are explained in the book, which make me believe, that there definitely is something on a different, what do I call it, a different plane, a different level, something which is spiritual, which we can't really understand when we're living in this life.
And that's why perhaps the ultimate hope is somebody asked you about your next great adventure, and you said that dying was your next great adventure. And I feel like the most hopeful and inspirational things of all the things you say in the book that feel hopeful, it's almost that sentiment of sort of banishing the fear and being more hopeful about the end, and not the end, as you say.
It was really funny because I was asked this question. It was an audience in US, about, I don't know, 10,000 people maybe. It was a huge auditorium. And I was asked that question. I'd never been asked before, what's your next great adventure? Well, a few years ago, I would have said, oh, going to the wild mountainous forests of Papua New Guinea, unexplored. But that's not for me now. I mean, I'm 87, nearly 88, and that won't happen. But so I thought for a bit, and I said, well, dying. And it was dead silence, a sort of gasp, horror, and then a few nervous titters. And so I said, well, when you die, there's either nothing, which, well, fine, it's nothing, or there's something. And I said, I just happen to feel, because of experiences I've had, that there's something. And if there is, what greater adventure can there be than finding out what that something is? And the woman who asked the question, she came up to me afterwards, Dr. Goodall, thank you. I never, ever liked to think about dying, but now I think of it differently. So I realized that what we fear isn't the actual death, it's the dying process, which can be so horrible.